Hey there guys, welcome to Asynchronous Programming Part 2. In this video we're going to be using everything with Part 1 about the async await, fetch API and applying those to 3 projects. As always guys, if you like the content, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. So let's just have a quick recap to refresh our memories regarding promises. So the evolution of promises started with callbacks because as we learned, JavaScript was single threaded, meaning it executes line by line in order. We first used callbacks to help us write asynchronous code. To create an async function and to call an async function, we first had to pass a callback as an argument, like you see on the screen here. But as you can see, this quickly led to callbacks becoming deeply nested, and this led to what we called earlier as callback hell. So to solve this issue, JavaScript introduced promises as part of ES6. And this essentially just simplified working with callbacks and made for better syntax. So what you would do is you create a promise, and then one of the most powerful features of ES6 was the ability to chain asynchronous operations together. So this allowed us to perform sequential operations in a more readable and organized manner. Chain promises would use the then method, which takes a callback function as its parameter. The callback function receives the resolve value of the previous promise as its argument, and then inside that callback function we return a new promise to continue the chain. Or if we wanted to have errors, we would just use the catch method, which as we saw earlier is called when any promise of the chain is rejected. Now even this approach wasn't foolproof, and chaining would have similar drawbacks to that of just regular callbacks, meaning that even chaining could lead to callback hell. So to tackle this, JavaScript with the release of this approach was an excellent way to avoid the previously discussed callback hell, but async await actually takes this even further. With async await you can see it's much easier to read, to follow and maintain, and essentially just came about as a way to improve the code readability for asynchronous operations, and this is the modern way now of using promises. Now the fetch API is basically just a feature that allows you to make HTTP requests to a web server, so you can make like get requests, post requests, put requests or delete requests. And what's really cool about it is that it's built into modern browsers, so you don't need any additional libraries or packages to use the Fetch API. And simply put, the Fetch API just makes it easy to get information from a website and do something with that data in your browser or whatever environment you're working in. The Fetch API itself is incredibly straightforward to use and offers an unmatched level of flexibility through the use of JavaScript promises for making requests from the web browsers. Now the Fetch API syntax is relatively straightforward. All you need is the URL of the resource you want to fetch, plus some additional code that tells the browser what to do with the response from the server. So again, the fetch function accepts 2 parameters. You got the URL to send the request to, and this is actually the required parameter. You need to give it a URL option, and then the second option here, things that you want to put in the request, such as the request method, i.e. a post or a get. But this is actually an optional parameter, but we will be using it in this video because it's pretty powerful. So as I mentioned, under the hood, the fetch API function actually just returns a promise. So for this example, actually, we're just going to use the .then and .catch, but later on we're going to be using async await because it's much more easier to use, manage, and it's much more readable. Now because the fetch is a promise, we can add the .then and .catch to handle the response and handle any errors. So what we'll do is just uncomment this, and we'll say .then, we'll say response, and we actually just do this all in one line, console.response, or we can have the .catch, which is going to handle any errors for us. Now a couple of things that you can see here. By default the Fetch API is a GET request, so you can see here it's actually trying to get some information from a remote server, and you can see in the response that we've got the status for 404 again saying that it's not found. That's because we haven't included a URL, which again, as I mentioned, is actually required for the Fetch API. Now the URL we're going to use for this example is just going to be some dummy API which just returns us some information that we can work with. So I'm just going to paste that in here, and this is basically just called dummy.json.com. So if you guys want to use this for your API examples, it's really easy to use and work with. So you can see now in the response inside of the console we're getting a status 200 because now we've actually given it a URL, and you can see that the body property here contains that readable stream. So to use the readable stream in our JavaScript application here, we just need to convert this to the JSON. So instead of logging it to the console, get the response and turn it into a JSON, and then obviously we need to add another then method to then log this to the console. So data, now let's log data to the console, and as you can see now the JSON method converts the readable stream into the JavaScript JSON object, so it's just a bunch of key value pairs. So it's basically just some information about the iPhone 9, so you've got the description, you've also got the ID, you've got some images, you've got the pricing, you've got the rating, and now that we have this data object we can use these values in any way we want. So for example, if we wanted to create a website which displays loads of products with a bunch of information, we can now do that using the Fetch API, and it really is that simple to use. And that's how we send a GET request using the Fetch API. And now again, as I mentioned, we can now display this data in the HTML. Now if you want to send a post request instead of a GET request, we need to define the second argument when calling the function, which is the option object, which is this object here. So inside of this, we need to define a method property and then specify which request we want. So the method that we want is the post method. Now when you send the post method, we also need to set the request header and the body properties to ensure a smooth process with the request. So for the header, we need to add a content type and then set that to application/JSON. So we'll say headers and the content type, and we want this to be an application JSON, and then we need to specify what data we want to send. We're going to need to create a body property in JSON format. So after the headers, we have the body, and then use the JSON stringify method to send the data through. So if we actually want to post something with this dummy text in regards to the products, we actually need to change this to add. Change this to add after the /. You can see it's already actually added one extra product, so you can see it's got an ID of 101, and the reason it has that is because products itself, if I just get rid of the add, you can see we've got a total of 100 products. So the first product is obviously that iPhone 9 that we had, because we specified the first product in our example, which was the iPhone 1. So if we want to add to this, you can see the ID now, you see it's already actually been added, and it's given it the ID of 101. Now we want to give it a few extra properties like a description, a price, an age, and a rating. So we'll say a description, iPhone 19, and then as well as the description, let's also add a price. This is going to be, let's say 1000, and then let's also do a rating, and let's say it's 9 out of 10. So you can see now we've successfully added a new item to our products here using the second parameter of the Fetch API, which is the option object. So all we need to do in this is just specify which method we want to use. We need to include the headers, so the content type we want to create is an application.json, and then in the body is where we include all the data that we want to add. So that's how we can create a post request. Let's now create a put request, which we're going to use to update an existing product. So we'll just grab our first product again and then create a put request, and as you can see, let's change it. So let's change the title actually to the iPhone 19, and then in the description you can say changed to iPhone 19. And if we open up the description, you can see, spelled that wrong, but you can see now we've updated our product here using the put method. And then lastly, what we can also do is actually to delete this product entirely with a delete request, and we just get rid of all of this stuff we don't need. That's in this to delete, and that's how we can delete a product. So now let's go ahead and use the Fetch API and work with it using Async await. So just get rid of all this. I'm just going to create a function, say const get all products. It's going to be an async function, and then let's just first create a variable which is going to be equal to our Fetch API. So say const response, and this is going to equal, use the await keyword, a fetch, and we're just going to paste our URL in here, which is just going to get all of our products, and then we want to turn this into JSON. So we'll say const JSON is going to equal another promise, which is going to be our response.json. So we get our response in a JSON format, and then we'll just console.log JSON. So you can see how easy and much more readable it is to work with async await when working with promises. So we'll actually put this in a try catch. So we'll paste that in here. Also catch error. So if we need to catch any errors, and then now let's call this. So get all products. And as you can see now, if we open this up, we're getting an array of 30 of the products, 30 out of the 100 products. See all the products that we're getting there using the async await and using the fetch API. And again, you can see how easy it is to read and how easy it is to work with using async await combined with the fetch API. So now we've learned about the fetch API and all the different requests. We're going to combine the fetch API with async await, and we're going to be creating 3 projects using these 2 topics. Okay, so the first project we're going to build here is this Chuck Norris Jokes API. So if you see here, we've got a title, got a paragraph section here, and then we've also got this button, as well as this pretty funky Chuck Norris image. Quite simply, all this is going to do is just load Chuck Norris jokes. So if I click on load another, you can see now it's loading us a Chuck Norris jokes. So when Chuck Norris makes cupcakes, the frosting on them is blood, just not his. Very good. And then if we load another one time Chuck Norris was crossing the street without looking both ways. He ran over a car. Again, another good joke. That's what we're going to be building in the Chuck Norris API. We've got Visual Studio Code open here, so it's fresh, empty project. We've got an index.html file, a style.css file, app.js file, and then also got the image folder, which has this image of Chuck Norris. The first thing we want to do in the index.html is just build the structure of the project. So we'll just say here, Chuck Norris jokes. Inside the body, we'll have a div with the ID of container, which is just going to house everything. And we're going to have a h2, which is going to say Chuck Norris API. Then inside of that, we'll have another div, which is going to contain our joke. So we'll say joke container, paragraph, and this is also going to have an ID of loading joke, and this is just going to say press load another for joke. And underneath our button, this is going to load joke btn. It's going to say load another, and then underneath that we'll have our image, which is just going to point to the image folder, Chuck. So Chuck Norris photo, and we'll also give this an ID of Chuck, and then we'll just open this up with live server. So we have a page here. Obviously it's got no styling at the moment. Do that next. So first we need to link style sheet into the style.css, and then while we're here, we'll also link the script file. So now we're ready to style our app here, and then we'll work with fetch and async await so we can retrieve Chuck Norris jokes. So we'll head into the style sheet, and then first we'll just target everything. So we'll say box sizing border box, set the margin 0, padding to 0, and then let's also set the font family to monospace. And then we'll grab the container, and then we'll set the position of this to relative, because we're going to be positioning the Chuck Norris image absolute in a moment. So we'll set the background color of this to be hashtag 1f1 f1 f1, sorry, just 1f, and then we'll make the height of this to be 100 viewport heights. We'll set the color of everything to be lime green, and then the font size, let's make it 1.56 rem actually. So it's nice and big, maybe a bit bigger actually, 1.8. And then we'll text align everything to the center. Overflow, let's just set that to hidden just in case. And then we'll just add some padding on the top and bottom, and 0 on the left and right. And then let's just make sure the width is 100%. The container. Then we want to grab the paragraph of what the joke actually loads in. We'll say container P, and we'll say line height for that is going to be 1.2 rem. Sorry, M. And let's just add a bit of margin top to this, so 20 pixels. Let's also add some margin bottom of 10 pixels. Font size, let's make it 1.3 rem. That's too small, let's say 1.8. Nice. And we'll also set the width of this to be 100% of the container. And let's just add a little bit of pattern on the left and right. So it's starting to look good. And then as for the container itself, we're going to make this a fixed height. So we'll say joke container, the div which wraps around this of the joke. We'll say set the height of this to be 200 pixels. And then we'll target the load button. So we'll say this is load joke ETN. This is going to have a background color. It's actually going to be transparent. Let's say border 1 pixels, solid lime green. Let's also set the color of this to be lime green. Set the cursor to the pointer. Let's set the font size to be 1.4 rem, see what that looks like. Maybe a bit bigger, let's say 1.6. That's good. Add some padding, so about 10 pixels. Let's set the text to be uppercase. And then let's set the margin to be 35 pixels, top and bottom, and then auto. And auto on the left and right. And we actually need to display this as block. That centers everything, puts the button in the right place. Let's focus on the Chuck Norris image. So this has an ID of Chuck Norris image. So this is going to have a width of 100%. We'll set the position of this to be absolute. We'll say bottom 0, right 0, and then left 0. So that's looking just like the example we've seen. All we need to do now is just be able to load the jokes once we click on this button here. So we'll do that with the Fetch API and Async await. So we'll go in the app.js. We'll just create a variable, say load joke. It's going to equal an async function, which is going to be an arrow function. We need to make it a function, and then we'll use the try catch. So inside the try, we're going to create a variable which is going to be, let's call it Chuck Norris fetch. And this is just going to equal, of course, the fetch API, and then we'll paste the API or the URL in here, and then this obviously takes another parameter. Inside this parameter, we're going to give it a header, and this is going to be a header for application /JSON. So that's the waiting for the fetch. Then we need to convert this to JSON. So we'll say const joke data is going to equal the await again, and Chuck Norris fetch dot JSON, which is going to turn it to JSON format for us. And then we need to get the actual value from this joke data to display in our app here. So we're going to say document dot get element by ID. We're going to target the load in joke ID, and then we're going to target the inner HTML, which is going to equal joke data dot value, which is going to be the joke. And obviously we'll have the catch which is just going to console log an error for us. If there is an error. And then lastly, to get the joke, we need to target the button here and add an event listener. So when we click on this, loads this function here, which is an async function, which is just going to get a random joke for us, or a random Chuck Norris joke for us. So say document dot get element by ID. We want to grab the load joke btn and add an event listener on this. It's going to be a click event, and we're going to target the load joke function. This should load us a Chuck Norris joke when we click on this. So if I click on the load another joke, so you can see it's giving us a joke straight away. If I click on it again, it gives us another joke, and it'll keep giving us random jokes about Chuck Norris. So that's the first project that we created. Really simple to create. A really simple use of the fetch API, just turning it to JSON and then changing it in HTML whenever we click on the button using an event listener. Let's now move on to the second project, which is going to be a weather app. Alright guys, so this is going to be the second project that we're going to be building, which is going to be this weather app. So at the top here you see we've got a search bar, so we type in any city within the UK, and when we press the search bar it's going to give us some information about the weather for that particular city. So it's going to have the date, it's going to have the city, and then it's going to have an icon which displays what type of weather it is, describe the weather, also going to have the current temperature, and it's going to have some extra information here, so the highs and lows for that day. And then if we type in another city, let's say Newcastle, we hit enter, it shows us the data for Newcastle. So in Newcastle it's currently raining, the temperature there is 16 degrees, highs of 18 and lows of 15. So this is the weather application we're going to be building in this part of the video. So we've got our blank canvas here again, the result our async project, we've got a body, and we've got a bare bones HTML. We're going inside the body, and we're just going to have a container class, and this is going to be called app. Inside of app, we're going to have the search bar. So we'll just put a comment here saying search bar, and this is going to be a div with the ID of search bar. And then we're going to have an input, which is going to be the type of text. We're going to have the ID, set that to search bar input, and then we'll just have a placeholder on this. Search by city. Underneath that we're going to have our button, which is going to be that search icon. So we'll give this an ID of search icon, and this is going to be an icon which we're actually going to get from Font Awesome. So we'll paste that in here, and then we'll also paste Font Awesome CDN. So there you go, we get our little magnifying glass now to represent the search bar. So there's the input, so we could type in a city, and now we've got the button to submit the data that we type into here. So underneath the search bar, I have the date and the city. So we'll give this a wrapper class of info, paragraph, ID of date. Underneath that we'll have a 3, which is going to have the ID of city. Then underneath that we're going to have the description, so the description of the weather. I have an ID, the description. Underneath that, we're going to have temp, and then finally we're just going to have that animation at the bottom, which is the high and the low, which is this data here. I'm going to say extra info. So this is going to have an ID, extra info. Then we're going to have 2 div columns in here, and then also another class which is going to contain a header, and then going to contain a paragraph which is going to show that extra data. We'll say h5. We'll say highs, and then we'll have a paragraph, have the ID of temp max, duplicate column, lows, we'll have temp min. So just to go over that again, we're going to wrap the whole thing inside of a wrapper div which has the ID of app. Then we've got our search bar div which contains our input. We've also got a button which has a sort of search icon which we'll get from Font Awesome. So just copy and paste this link inside the GitHub, which I'll leave in the description below. So then you can use the icons from Font Awesome. So that's our search bar. Then we've got the date and city, which is just this data here. So the current date of that day, and then the name of the city that we searched. And then we've also got some description. So this is going to be the description that you see here. So the rain, and then the temp is obviously the temperature here. And then we've got the extra information, which is the 2 columns, so the highs and then the lows. So that's all the HTML we're going to need for this section. Let's just now link the script tag. The app.js, and then let's also link the style sheet so we can work on the CSS. So let's go ahead now and style this. So we'll head inside the style sheet, and this is going to be quite a large style sheet. So let's get started. We'll grab everything and we'll say box sizing to be border box, set the margin and padding to 0, and let's set the font family, let's set it to Montserrat, and then if that fails, set it to sans serif. So let's grab the app, which is the container. We're going to set the position of this to be relative, set the width to 414 pixels, we'll set the height to be 420 pixels, set display, block, margin, let's set that to auto, so it's in the middle, and we'll say text align, let's put that to the center, give it some padding on the top and bottom, overflow, just set that to hidden, and then let's give this a border radius of about, let's say about 45 pixels. And then the background image for this is going to be a linear gradient. So I'm just going to copy and paste it in here because I'm not going to write it all out because there's quite a few values. So there's our app there, so it's going to contain everything. We'll now work on the search bar. So we'll grab the search bar, we'll set the value to display flex, and let's set the color to be white, and then we'll start the input. So we'll say search bar input. This is going to have background color of none. We'll set the border of this to be none. So we'll basically just strip it of all its styling. So we'll set the outline to none. Width, let's make it about 90%. Let's actually add some padding to the search bar on the left and right. So we'll say padding 0 on the top and bottom, but 40 pixels on the left and right. And then let's add a bit of margin at the bottom of this too. So about 30 pixels. And then let's also just set the background of this to also be transparent. And we'll set the color of the text to be white. And then let's just add a little border bottom of this to be solid 1 pixels, and we'll just make it, let's say, light blue. So that's starting to take some shape now. Let's also change the input text or the placeholder. So we'll target the placeholder attribute, and we'll say color, let's make that white, and then opacity, let's make it slightly see-through, and then for the icon we'll say let's target the icon, and then we'll remove the border for this. We'll make the background of this transparent too. We'll set the color to be white, and then we'll make the font size of the icon 1.5 rem, so it's nice and bigger. Let's now target the extra info here. So we'll say extra info. We'll position this at the bottom, so we'll say position absolute. So from the bottom about 5 pixels. Set the width of it to be 100%. We'll set the display of this to be flex. Justify content space around. Set the color to be let's say, just make this white as well, and then let's add some padding to the bottom of this, 30 pixels, and then we'll target the heading and the paragraph. So we'll say extra info h5. We'll set the font size of this to be a bit bigger, so 1.1 rem, and then we'll also make this uppercase. So that's the extra info. Let's also add a bit of margin to the top of that app here. Let's say about 20 pixels, just to get it a bit lower down. So now what we're going to do is actually go and fetch the data first, because we can't see the data at the moment, so I don't want to put the styling on until we can actually see the data, or how we can input it inside of our app here. So we'll go ahead and do that first. Now for this API, we're going to be using the Open Weather API. Now this actually requires a API key, but all you need to do is just sign up to this, and then you'll get your free API key to use to work on your projects. And then all you need to do is just paste it where you need to put the API key to then retrieve the data, which I'll show you guys in a moment anyway. So we've got our API key there, so I'll just copy this, and I'm just going to paste it in there as a comment. So we'll go back to our app here, and the first thing we want to do is actually target some of the stuff here that we want to display when we get that data. So we want to target things like the date, the city, the description, the temp. We want to target the temp max here. So we're going to need to create variables for them. So we'll say const, we'll target the date first. This is going to equal document.getElement by ID, and this has the ID of date. So we've got that. Then we're going to need one for the city. So document.getElement by ID. This has the ID of city. And then we'll do the same for, the temp. Also do the same for the temp image, which we'll work on in just a second. So this has the ID of temp, and then I actually forgot to include the temp image div. So let's just call this image, or weather image, doesn't really matter. And this is going to have the ID of temp image, so we'll target that here. Then we want to target the description. And then just a couple more, so the max, the temp max and the temp min. So we'll say const temp max equals document.getElement by ID. This has the ID of temp max, and then obviously we've got the last one, which is min. Now to display this date, which has got the month, the actual date, and then the year, we're going to need to create an array which is going to have all the months of the year, so we can set it to that depending on what the current date is. So first we'll just do const, say months, which is going to equal an array of all the months. So we've got January, February, March, April, and I'll just paste the rest in because it's too long to type. So that's all the months of the year. We then need to create a new date object so we can target the month and the day as well as the year. So we'll say let grab the date equals new date object, so a new instance of that. Say date object actually. So we've got the date object, and let's grab the month from that. So we'll say this is going to equal months, and target the date object dot get UTC month. And what this is basically doing is just targeting the date object, and then using the func of the date object to get us the month, which is inside the months array. So it's just going to essentially equal whichever month it is, and then display that month. So now we've got the month. Let's do the day. Let day equals the date object dot get UTC date. That's 1. So that's the day, and then we'll get the year. So let year equals date object dot get UTC full year. And then all we need to do is just display this in our app here. So we'll say date dot inner HTML is going to equal month, the day, and then the year. And it's currently not displaying it, so let's check out the console. Let's target the actual date object. So as you can see now, that's displayed. So obviously we haven't got any styling on this, but we'll do the styling in just a moment. Let's actually fetch the data now to work with this. So we actually first need to target the whole app. So say const app equals document dot get element by ID. Probably should have put that at the top, but it doesn't matter. And this is the ID of app. And then we'll say const get weather. It's going to be an async function. And we're going to have a try catch. So we'll say const weather data fetch. This is going to equal the await fetch API, and we're just going to paste the URL for that in here. So we'll paste the open weather API URL in here. So at the moment we're hard coding the city that we're putting in, but we're going to make this dynamic in just a moment. But we just want to display some data. So obviously we're going to need our app ID. So we've got it set up here in there. So also put the catch in here. Log the error in case. And then obviously we want to put some headers in here. This is going to be exactly the same as the other one. This is going to be an application JSON, and it's not liking something. So we need to put the header inside of here, and then we need to add a header, and this is going to be application / JSON. So that's our fetch API. We obviously now need to turn this into JSON format. So we'll say const weather data equals await weather data fetch dot JSON. So that turns that into JSON format. So now we can log this to the console, see what it returns us. Weather data. So let's call this. And as you can see now, it's returning us some data. So it's returning us London, and then it's got loads of other properties that we can work with. So it's returning us the temperature, and then also returning us things like clouds, the coordinates. It's also got time zone, the actual weather itself. So we've got things like the cloud, the icon that will display, the description that we're going to be using. So all of these properties now we can work with and then display in the front end. So now what we need to do from here is target all of these variables that we created, which targets all the IDs of all the HTML elements, and then use the properties that we get from the fetch to change in the HTML of these so we can display them on the app here, just like we've done with the date. So we'll first grab the name, so it displays the city name. So we'll say city.inner HTML is going to equal, let's use backticks, and this is going to target the weather data, and it's going to target the name. If I refresh this, we should now get the name. You see we've got London. Let's now do the same for the image. So the way we're going to do the image is we're going to grab the variable of temp image, and we're going to grab the inner HTML, and then we're actually going to create an image tag, which is going to have the source attribute, which is just going to equal the open weather map URL, which is for the image. So I'm just going to paste that in here. And that's going to grab our weather icon. And then we'll do the same for the description. So say .inner HTML. And we're going to target the weather data again. Say .weather. And then we're going to target the index number, which is 0. And then we're going to target the main. So you see we get clouds. So just to see what that looks like, we fetch the weather data. We go inside the weather property. We go inside the index number of 0. This has the property of main, which is the clouds, which is our description. Then next we want to target the image. So we'll say temp image, or not the image, the icon that we're going to be displaying. We'll say .inner HTML equals, and then we're actually going to create an image tag in here. And then set the source attribute to the open weather map URL, and then put the custom data that we fetch from the API so we get the correct icon. So this is going to be the image tag. I'm going to grab the source attribute, and this is going to be equal to that URL. So it's going to be http open weather map org image, and then we're going to grab the custom data from the fetch API, and then this is going to be the weather data dot weather property, and we're going to grab the index number of 0, and then we're going to grab the icon, and then we'll say at, so make it 2x.png, then we'll close this off, and you can see we're now getting that icon. And the way this actually goes and gets that icon is that we're grabbing the weather data, we're getting the JSON response, and then we're going inside the weather property, going in the first index, and then we're grabbing the main property, which is equal to clouds, and we're grabbing the icon, which is a specific string which will display the clouds icon or whatever icon we get from the response. So that's how we include the image. And then all we need to do is just include the actual weather as well as the highs and lows. So we'll do that here. We'll grab the temp.inner HTML, and then this is going to equal a h2, and we're going to round this to the nearest number. We'll say math.round, and then chuck that property in here. So weather data dot main dot temp, and that's going to be our temperature there. And then let's just put degrees Celsius in here. Close that off, and then we'll do the one for temp max dot inner HTML. And this is just going to equal backticks weather data dot main dot temp max, and then we'll do min, and then we'll just get the degrees Celsius in there for those two. So now we've pretty much got all the data. The only thing that's left to do is just make the data here dynamic, so when we type in a name it will display that name. But before we do that, let's just go ahead and finish the styling for this. So we'll head back in the style sheet. Let's first style the date and the city. So it says the ID of info, so let's just do that after the input there. We'll say info, so we'll target the info, and let's make the line height of this to be 0.5 rem, make the color white, and then let's target the h4, which is the city name. So we'll say font size, let's make this pretty big, let's say 40 pixels. This is a h3, I think this is actually a h3, not a h4. And let's make the font weight, let's make that bold. Let's text transform it to uppercase, and then let's add some margin there. So margin, let's say 2em. Say 0.5em. Okay, maybe a little bit bigger. There you go. And then we've got the icon. Let's target the description. So this is going to have the ID of description. And let's just make this text. Transform. We'll set this to uppercase. And let's also change the color of this to white. Probably because it's all white, we could literally just target the color in the global settings, but it doesn't really matter for now. But you could do it that way because it's pretty much all white. So the last thing to target is the actual degrees itself. So the temperature. So we'll go underneath the description. We'll grab the temperature. And this has just the ID of temp. So we'll say color, make this white. Font size, let's make it about 40 pixels, see what that looks like. Too big, let's try 20 pixels. Be small, let's try 30. Looks good. Let's add a bit of, let's actually make the icon a bit smaller. We'll just remove the so we'll just remove the size property here. So we'll just remove the size in the URL there for the source. So that just makes it smaller because we don't really need it that big. Because we're more interested in the temperature. So let's add some margin top to that. Say 20 pixels. Yeah, it's looking much better. So that's pretty much it for the styling. I think now all we need to do is just make this dynamic, so when we type in a city name, it will display that name and display the name of the city, the date, and then also the temperature, as well as some description and an icon. So this is actually really easily done. All we need to do is just target the value attribute of whatever we type in here in the input. So we get that, and then we dynamically add it to the fetch API in here. So we change this to whatever the variable is going to be, and then it grabs the input value of what it inserts and then uses that value for the fetch, and it will get the data for the city that we want. So we'll just go above this, say const city name equals document dot get element by ID. I'm going to get the search input, search bar input, sorry. I think it's got the ID of search bar input. Yeah, so just copy that to make sure. So we want to grab the value attribute of this. So whatever we enter into our input here is what the value is going to be. In this case, we want it to be a city name. And then to make this dynamic, and then where we've hard coded London, we need to add the city name in here, but we actually need to put this in backticks. So that works. Now it's currently going to return us undefined, and it's not going to be able to get us the data because it's calling this right now, so it's fetching nothing because there is no value that we've inserted inside of our input here. So we actually need to get rid of it here because we don't need to call it. We only need to call this when we hit the search bar. So we've got our index.html, and then where our button is, we add an onClick attribute. So on click, and that's going to be equal to our fetch API variable, so get weather. Spelled click wrong. So now this button has the on-click attribute, which is going to call our get weather fetch API, and it's going to retrieve us the data that we want. So if we type in city name in here, so we'll just type in London. This now that we input here is going to be equal to this value, which is then going to be equal to the parameter that we need inside of our URL to retrieve us the data. So now if we search this, we see we're getting London again with all the data that we had before when it was hard coded. If we want to get another city, let's get Kent, it'll give us Kent, and then we'll do one more, and then let's say Glasgow. It returns us the data for Glasgow. So a really cool dynamic application using the fetch API and async await. We're now going to move on to our final project, which is going to use the Pokemon API. As for our last project, we're going to be building this Pokedex, which if you're familiar with Pokemon, you'll know what this is. And what we're going to be able to do here is that if we type in a Pokemon name, it will display that Pokemon image for us. So we've got Charizard as our first example. And let's say if we want to display Bulbasaur, we'll just type it in here, Bulb I saw, and if we enter that, we're getting an image of Bulbasaur now in the Pokedex screen. And whatever Pokemon we type in here, if it's inside the Pokemon API, which we're going to be using in this example, it will fetch that image for us and display it in the screen. So that's what we're going to be building in our last project here. So we've got a blank HTML file here, and we've got our blank web browser. The first thing I'm going to do is just link our two style sheets. So we'll say style 1 and then style 2. And the reason we're doing this is because there's going to be quite a lot of CSS style in here. So I want to separate the one half of the Pokedex and style it in one style sheet, and then style the second one in another style sheet. And then lastly, I'm just going to copy and paste the Font Awesome CDN in here so we can use the icon for the search bar. So that's all we're going to need for that. Now inside the body, we're going to wrap all of this inside a container. And then we're just going to have a comment here saying first half of Pokedex. And this is going to be this half here. So we'll wrap this in a div with the ID of Pokedex 1. And then inside of the Pokedex 1 section, we're going to have another section which is going to house the screen here, and then all these little buttons at the top here. And then we'll have a div which is going to house all of these buttons here. So we'll build the first section here first. So we'll just call this div top. And then we'll have the section for this bit. So we'll go top square, square one. And in the top square we have the circle. We have this circle here. So we'll give this a ID of button white. And then inside of that you can see we've got another circle. So we'll give this an ID of button blue. We've got that section there. Then underneath that, top square, another section, which is this section here, which is these three buttons. So that's going to be really simple. It's going to be top square, let's call it top square 2. And this is just going to have 3 divs. One is going to be button red, duplicate that 2 more times, and then button green, and then button yellow. And then we'll have the screen underneath this. So we'll give this an ID of screen. And inside of this screen, you can see we've got a red button. So we'll give it an ID of button red screen. And then we've got 2 bars that you can see here. So we'll say of bar 1 and bar 2, and then you can see there's also like a mini screen inside of this which is going to house the image. So we'll say screen 2. Inside of that we'll have image tag. We'll leave the source attribute empty at the moment. We'll work on that in a bit. We'll just give this an ID of Pokemon image. Don't need the alt. So that's the top section of the first half. Let's now build the bottom section. So underneath the div of top, we'll go underneath that. We'll just put a comment here as well. Top half. So this is just going to have the ID of bottom, and then it's just going to be a bunch of divs which is going to represent all of these buttons here. So first we'll have one for the blue, button blue, maybe an ID, say 2, because we already have an ID of button blue. Then we'll have one for yellow, and then we'll have one for the D-pad. Well, it's going to be 2 actually, because we're going to fix these in the styling. So we'll say D-pad horizontal, and then d-pad vertical. And then finally we have one more, oh sorry, two more actually. We need the select, we need these buttons here. So that's going to be select and the start. So that's the first half of the Pokedex. We're now going to move on to creating the hinge and then the second half. So underneath the top half here, we'll just fold that. We'll have the hinge, which is quite simply just going to be a div, the ID of hinge, and then the second half of Pokedex. But this is going to have a similar sort of layout to the first half of the Pokedex, so we'll just call this Pokedex 2. And in this you can see we're going to have like a sort of hidden div here, so it lines up with the first Pokedex. So if this was to fold in a roll off example, it would look consistent. So we'll just have the ID of top square, and then it's going to have a div of hidden. And then we're going to have the search bar underneath this. Which is going to have the input type text, and it's going to have the ID of search name, and then placeholder we'll say, and then we'll have a button underneath this, which is going to have an icon class with the class of fa-search, and we'll set the area, and we're going to work on this button in just a moment. We'll also actually need to give this an ID of search btn. So now there's going to be three other sections. So we're going to have the sections for the blue squares, this section here for these two buttons. So after the search bar, we're going to have these three sections here. So we've got one section, two sections, three sections, which again are just divs. So we'll do this bit here, which is going to be using the grid layout. So we'll go underneath the search bar. We'll wrap these in a div called section 2. And then we'll create divs for each of these sections. So there's going to be 8 different boxes, so 8 divs. And we'll give them the class of squares. So we'll do this 8 times. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So that's going to be for that section. Then we've got the third section here, which is just 3 divs. So we'll wrap this in a div of section 3, and then we'll have a div for these 2 buttons of the Pokedex. So we'll give this, ID of 2 squares. Then we'll have 2 divs with the ID of 2, and then we'll have one for the yellow button. So we'll just give this an ID of bottom yellow btn. And then lastly we have this section here, which is just 2 divs. So we'll say section 4, and we'll have 2 divs with a class of bottom 2. So that's all we're going to need for the HTML. If we head into our browser here, you can see how much styling we're going to need to do for this, because all we've got right now is the search input and the search bar icon button. So as you can see, I've split the styles. So we've got style 1, which is just going to be for the top section of the Pokedex, so the Pokedex 1, which is this section here, and then style 2 is going to be styling this one. So we'll go ahead and crack on with that now, because it's quite an extensive style sheet. So first we're just going to grab the body, and this is just going to center our Pokedex. So display flex, line items to the center, justify content to the center, height will be 100%, width will be 100%, and then let's give a background color of this to say FCE386, and then we'll just give a padding top of this. Let's say 20 VH. So you can see now it's centering our Pokedex. With that, let's grab the first half of the Pokedex and style that. So we'll say it's got the ID of Pokedex 1, which is this ID here, and this is going to have a width of 350 pixels, a height of 520 pixels, and set this display of block, margin, set that to auto, and then the background of this is going to be that red color, so FC2243. So there's the first half of the Pokedex, and we'll set the Z index of this to also be 3, and then we'll target the container of top, which has a width of 75%. We'll also set the display of this to be block, and set margin, auto, height, say 50%, set the position of this to be relative, background of none, border radius 0%, and then we'll set the Z index this to be 1. Next, let's target the top half of this Pokedex. So it's this ID there. So we're going to position, we'll first display this as block. Let's give it a width of 55%. Margin, let's give it auto. Give it a darker background color, 50625. Set the Z index of this to be 1, and then the height of this to be, say, 25%. So there's our little block there, and then let's position this to be absolute, and then from the left, say minus 16.5%. So that puts it in the little corner there. Now let's target the buttons inside of this. So we've got the button white and the button blue. So we'll say button white. We'll give this to, say, background color of white, border radius of 50%. Let's give it a width of 50 pixels, height of 50 pixels, display of block, margin, say auto, so a little bit differently, so position absolute, from the top say about 10%, and then from the left about 5%, and then a Z index of 2, and then we'll target the blue circle inside of this next. So this has an ID of blue. This is going to have a background color of a light blue, so 71 CDF4. Border radius, so this is also going to be 50%. Width, let's make it 85%. Height, also 85%. Display of this to be block. Margin be 0. And then we'll do some more positioning. Absolute, sorry, the margin should be auto. So we'll say from the top about 8%, and then from the left about 3%. And we'll have a Z index of 3, so it's on top of everything. And now I've got the border radius, so border radius also 50%. From the left, actually, sorry, let's push it a little bit more, let's say 8%, so it's more central. It's looking good now. Next we'll target the top square here, which has these 3 buttons there. But firstly, I forgot to actually put this inside of the top square div, otherwise it's going to look really funky. So let's do that first, make sure you do that, and then we'll grab the ID of top square 2, And we'll set the display of this to be block, the margin to be auto. Let's set the background color of this to be the same color there, dark red. Let's set the Z index to 3, and then we'll set the height to be 60%, width to be 162%. And then we'll position this a little bit differently. So position absolute, and then from the left, let's say 80%. So that pushes that along, and that completes that top section there. So now let's just target those buttons. So first we'll target the red button. So this has an ID of button red. So this will have a background color of that lighter red. Border radius of 50%. Width will be 15 pixels. Height will be 15 pixels. Set the display to block, and then position this absolute. Let's also get rid of. Let's also set the margin to auto. And say top 45%, left minus 18%, and the Z index, set that to 2. So that's the red button there. Copy. Let's just duplicate this now for the other 3 because they're quite similar. So it would be button red, and then button green, and button yellow. So they're going to have some different styling. So button green is going to have a different color, of course. So 5, 8, BB69. Button yellow is going to have FFC F54. Now obviously the position is going to be a little bit differently. So for button green it's going to be minus 8%, and then for button yellow it's 2%. So there's all our buttons there. That's completed the top half. Let's now do the screen. So which is this section here, which is going to house the picture. So we're going to say ID of screen, be position absolute, background color of a slightly grayish color, E6, E6, E6. We'll set the display of this to be block. We'll say margin, auto, border radius of 5%. Say position of this to be absolute. Let's also see this now, so let's set the height to be 75% and the width to be 100%. So what we need to do now is just position this a little differently. So we'll say from the bottom, say minus 10%. Oh, minus. So that positions our screen. Let's create the second screen inside of that. So screen 2. So the position is to be absolute. It's actually pretty similar to this one. So paste the details in there, and then we'll just change a few things. So the width of this is going to be 80%, and then top is going to be 10%, left is going to be %, and the background of the color of this is going to be a little bit different. So it's going to be EF, E5, F6, FC, and the border radius is going to be a bit bigger, so 8%. So there's our screen there. So we nearly complete the first half of our Pokedex. So now let's target the bottom section. We'll say bottom, set the width of that to be 100%, display of that to be block, margin, set it to auto, height 50%, and let's set the border radius of this to be, let's just say something small like 5 pixels, and then set the position of this to be relative. Now we're just going to target the buttons of all of this. So we've got the blue button, the select and start, D-pad, and then this button here. But first let's just do the start, which will set the cursor to a pointer, set the width to be 15%, set display of block, margin 10 pixels, auto, so 10 pixels top and bottom, and then on the left and right. Set the height of this to be 8%, and this absolute. So we'll say from the left, we'll say 48%, and then from the top, say 30%. And then let's just give it this color. So background color is going to be F07147. So there's our select. Let's add a border radius to this of 30 pixels. And then we'll do the same for the select, so it's quite similar. So we'll just duplicate this actually. We'll do the select. And the select has a different color. So 58BB69, so it's like a greenish color. And then from the left it's going to be 30%, so it's next to the start button. So that's the two buttons. Let's now do the two other buttons, so the blue and the yellow one. So this has the ID of button blue 2. This is going to be a cursor pointer. It's a background color of 16979. Set the border radius to be 50%, width to be 50 pixels, height to be 50 pixels, set the display to block, margin again to auto, and then set the position of this to be absolute, and then say from the top 29%, from the left 5%, and then the Z index to be 2. So there's our button there. We'll duplicate this for the yellow one. So button yellow 2. This will have a more yellow color. So FFC 54. And then the top is going to be 59%. And then from the left, it's going to be 25%. Showing, oh, sorry, I've actually didn't duplicate this. So again, this is going to have the color of FFC F54, be that yellow color, and then from the top we go again, so 59% on the top and then 25% on the left, and let's actually make the width of this to be 120 pixels, and the border radius is going to be just 5%. So there's that button there. All that's left to do now is just include the D-pad. So go underneath this, and we'll grab the D-pad horizontal. And this is going to be again a cursor pointer, background color. This is going to be a slightly grayish, dark grayish color, 404040. Height is going to be 80 pixels. The width is going to be 23 pixels. And then we'll position it as we'll set the display, to block again. Set the position of this to be absolute. And we'll say the width, and then we'll say top. It's going to be 32% from the right percent. And then let's just duplicate this for the other D-pad. So this is D-pad vertical. And then of course it's going to be a little different, so the width of this is going to be 80 pixels and the height of it is going to be 23 pixels. And then of course from the right it's going to be 8%, and then from the top it's going to be 42%. So as you can see now, that completes our Pokedex. I'm just going to make the screen 2 here to be a bit of a less of a border radius. So as you can see now, that's completing our first half of the Pokedex, which is this section here, so it's looking pretty good. Now let's move on to the hinge and the second part of the Pokedex. So let's move into the second style sheet. And the first thing I'm going to do is just grab the container, which is wrapping around all of this, and we'll set the display to flex. And we'll grab the hinge, and this is going to have a width of 20 pixels. Background color of D50625, and we'll set the border radius of this to be, let's just say 5 pixels. Set the height to be 470 pixels, and then margin top to be 45 pixels. So there's our hinge. Now let's target the second Pokedex, or the second half of the Pokedex. Pokedex 2, set the width to be 350 pixels, set the height to be 450 pixels, set the display to be block, margin top, let's make it a little bit lower, so 70 pixels so it looks consistent. So the background color to be FC 2243, Z index 23, set position relative. We have a bit of an issue here, and that's because the margin top, not margin all the way around. And then now let's target the hidden element, which is this section here, so it just looks consistent with the other side of the Pokedex. So this has an ID of hidden. Set the position of this to be absolute. We'll set the background color of that light red, height to be 30 pixels, and we'll set the width to be 60%. And then from the top, let's say minus 30 pixels. So you see now it's looking more consistent. Let's now style the search bar. We'll grab the ID of the search bar. So the background color of this to be black. Display of flex. Height of 50 pixels. And then say margin top. Let's set that to 60 pixels. Margin left. Set that to 20 pixels. So it's looking a little bit funky now, but we'll fix this, don't worry. So let's target the name. So search name. It's going to have a width of 90%. Set the border to none. Background color to a light grey. So 404. Set the color of the text to be Azure. Outline, let's remove it. Again, let's make the height 50 pixels. To the left, and then font size, say 1.6 rem. So that's the search name. Let's also grab the placeholder. Style that. So this is just going to have a font size 6 rem, and then let's just add a bit of margin left to this too, of 5 pixels, and set the color of it to be light grey. So now let's target the button. It's going to have a color of white, a background color dark or sort of light grey. Set the height to be 52 pixels, and then say the font size for the icon, let's make it 20 pixels. So that's it for the search bar and the search button. Let's now target the second section, which is these squares here. So this has the wrapper of section 2. It's going to have a height of 100 pixels, a width of 88%, margin set it to 20 pixels, set display to grid, and then grid template columns are going to be repeat of 4 columns and then a width of 1 fractional unit, and then we'll say grid gap of 5 pixels, squares, so this has the ID of squares, or they all do, all of those divs, sorry, the class of squares. We'll just set the background color of that to be aqua, those squares. Let's now target third section, so this has the ID of section 3. Set the height of this to be 70 pixels, the margin to be 10 pixels, and then display of flex. Justified content is going to be space between squares. 2 squares, you have the 2 squares container, so width is going to be 100%, and display of flex. And then let's target those 2 divs, which have the class of 2. So it's just going to have a background color of beige. Width is going to be 60 pixels. And the margin of, say, 5 pixels. Get the yellow button. So yellow button. Set the width of this to be 50 pixels. Height to be 50 pixels, background color, let's make it like a yellowy orange, FC F54, then margin right 30 pixels, margin top to be 10 pixels, and then the border radius to be %. And it's not showing because it's got a different ID. Well, let's make the border radius a little less than that one, see what 40% looks like. Nah, let's go back to 50. And then set the be 60 pixels. And the height to also be 60 pixels. So that's looking better. Now let's do the bottom 2 buttons, these sections here. So grab section 4, set the width of this to be 91%, margin to be 15 pixels, display flex, and then justified content space between, and then we'll just target those 2 divs. So section 4, bottom 2. Set the height of these to be 40 pixels, width to be 130 pixels, and then lastly just grab the background color, which is going to be as 40404 at 40. So that completes our styling for the Pokedex. Now let's use the Fetch API and Async await to then type a Pokemon name in here and then display the image on the screen. So we'll head inside the app.js and we'll say const get Pokemon equals async and then we'll put this in a try, and we'll say, let's first get the data, so const Pokemon data equals the await, grab the fetch API, use backticks, and then we'll paste the Pokemon API inside of this. So this is HTTPS, and then it's called Poke API.co/API/v2 for version 2 /Pokemon. And then after this Pokemon, we have another slash, which is where you'd put the Pokemon name in the parameter, but we're going to be making this dynamic, so we're going to put in the actual Pokemon name that we type in here. So it's just going to follow a similar sort of thing that we did in the weather API. So let's just do some validation here. So we'll say if the Pokemon data is not okay, so using the exclamation mark at the start there, then we'll just throw an error saying new error, could not find Pokemon. So after that validation, we'll just fetch the data or turn it into a JSON format. So we'll say const data equals await, and then we'll grab the Pokemon data, which we'll be awaiting, and then we'll return it as JSON. And then we want to grab a property inside of that, which is going to be the Pokemon image. So we'll say const Pokemon image is equal to the data that we return, dot the sprites property, dot the front default, which again is just a property inside of the data that gets returned back. And then we need to display this image, so we're going to grab the image ID, so display Pokemon equals document dot get element by ID Pokemon image, and then we're going to grab that, which is the image, and we're going to say display Pokemon, grab the source attribute of that Pokemon and set it equal to Pokemon image, which changed the name there slightly. And then we need to display this, so we're going to have to set the display the style value of block. So we'll say display Pokemon dot style dot display is equal to block. So we'll set the catch on this. We'll say error console.log error if there is any errors. And then all we need to do now is just assign the value, the input value that we get from this input, and set it to the parameter of the Pokemon API. So we'll go above this, so const Pokemon name is equal to document dot get element by ID. So really similar to how we did it in the weather API. This is the search name input. So this input here, we want to grab the value of that, but also set the value that we put in here, automatically set it to lowercase, so using the lowercase method. So every time we type in a value, it will always turn it to lowercase, and then all we need to do is just insert it into this parameter here, so Pokemon image, sorry, Pokemon name. So now we have that parameter, so whatever value we put in here will display our Pokemon inside of the screen there. And we actually need to call this method in the search bar here. So we'll go back to the index.html. Inside of the button, we'll have an onClick, and we'll set that to whatever the so it's get Pokemon method. Paste that in there. And now if we click on the search, if we type in a Pokemon, so we'll put in Bulbasaur again. If we search that now, you see we're getting that image of Bulbasaur. We just need to style this now so it fits the whole screen. So we'll say Pokemon image. We'll set the Z index to be 1000, just so it's always on top. And set the width to 100%. let's set the height to 100%. See, now it's working just as our original example, and if we type in another Pokemon, so let's say Charizard, and hit enter, you see now it's displaying as Charizard Pokemon, and whatever Pokemon is inside the Pokemon API will now work. So that's it for our last project. I hope you guys enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope you learned a lot about how we can work with Fetch API, using Async await and working with APIs, create cool projects.